because I went back to Bath for the weekend to stay with my parents because I wasn't playing, obviously. I went to a family friend's house for a barbecue, had lunch, literally went down to the swimming pool. They had this feature pool. I hadn't been there before, but it was like not something you expect to see in Somerset, something you more likely see in the Hollywood Hills, but it had like a rock fall in one end and a waterfall in one end. And I just, wasn't paying attention, took my t-shirt off and dived in where the waterfall hit the water. And I think because where the waterfall hit the water, it was making the ripples, you couldn't see how deep it was, but you just kind of assume, if you don't stop to look, that where a waterfall is, it's probably deep. And there was a big rock face coming in, and I was about 18 and a half stone at the time, looked very different to what I do now. And I dived in at a steep angle, and what I thought was about 8 feet of water turned out to only be about 3 feet of water. So hit my head right on the top of my head. The disc in between C6 and C7 vertebrae, which is at the bottom of your neck, exploded, and one of the shards of disc cut my spinal cord in half. So what was a 12 millimeter thick spinal cord was now 6 millimeters thick, and my neck was dislocated. So it was a pretty serious spinal cord injury. I remember thinking, wow, that hurt. I've hit my head hard before. Playing rugby, you do it for a living, but not that hard. And I thought I'd stand up, check if there's any blood coming off the top of my head, and try and not get any blood in that pool. But then it was when I couldn't move properly that it really dawned on me that there was something serious going on.
Doctor's Kitchen. Recipes, health, lifestyle.
Take us back to prior to the accident, what your life was like. You're playing professionally. Who was Ed back then?
Oh, good question. It depends who you're asking, I suppose. My mum would have probably said I was a little tearaway and hard to keep a handle on, but I was obviously quite an energetic kid. I suppose I was born quite big compared to the rest of my peers, so rugby ended up being quite a natural route. I'm from the southwest of England, from Bath. It's a big rugby town. And I actually I had a little bit of a sheltered upbringing, if you like. Lived out in the countryside, and sort of just with my brother, who was 3 years younger than me. We kind of entertained ourselves, and I was a bit of an introvert, actually. But then I ended up getting a rugby scholarship to a school called Millfield down in the southwest, which is a big sporting school, and things sort of progressed from there. Ended up playing for England under 16s, went through the age group system, through all the international stuff, and signed for Bath after I left school, which was obviously a childhood dream of mine, my hometown club. So living the dream as you were. Struggled with a few shoulder injuries. I used to be a swimmer when I was younger, so I think over mobile shoulders, then going into a contact sport, running into 20 stone blokes wasn't ideal. But I managed to I still managed to have a 10-year reasonably successful professional career, which I absolutely loved. Played for 5 different clubs in the English Premiership and in Wales as well. And that was all I really knew. My identity was wrapped up in being a rugby player, and being a professional sportsman. So, I sure get onto it, but when my life looks very different now, and when I had the accident, that was a tough thing to take, because all I'd ever known was running around on a rugby pitch, and all of a sudden I was in a position where running around was definitely not an option anymore.
And so your brother sounds like he was pretty sporty. What about your parents and stuff? Were they pretty supportive of that sort of sporting culture? Or were they sports people themselves?
Not really, actually. My dad was a doctor.
Right.
He's a big football fan. He supports Sheffield Wednesday for his sins. So he's constantly depressed about the sport that he supports. And my mum hated the fact I played rugby. In fact, never came to watch me play because of the nature of the sport and it being so physical. But they're very supportive. They're great parents. So because it was my sort of passion, it's what I wanted to do with my friends, they supported me wholeheartely. But no, there's no history of sport really in my family. Having said that, they're both reasonably coordinated people. They play tennis and things. But no, it was just because of, I think, my circumstance of where I was living in the West Country and what my friends were doing was the reason I fell into it.
Yeah, and I'm sure we'll get to it when we talk about, what drives you and what motivates you to achieve such incredible feats despite your limitations physically. But your personality, were you pretty competitive back then? I mean, it sounds like you would have been, considering you were successful at such a young age in sports. Were you that sort of mindset, like that David Goggins style, like just nothing can stand in your way?
I think to a certain extent, not as extreme as David Goggins,
Yeah.
that's for sure. But I think naturally, as a sports person, you must have had that in you to a certain extent. I think I'm definitely not one of those people who it's do or die. If I lose at something, I throw my toys out the pram. I think I've managed to stay relatively level-headed throughout my career, because it has been one of ups and downs. I've had highs of getting my Premiership debut for Bath at 18 years old, to captaining my country at age group levels, but then having to sit out for 9 months with shoulder injuries, nearly retiring at 21, being released from clubs, being signed by other clubs. So it's been a roller coaster, and I think being able to manage that emotionally is a very hard thing. And I think it's where we see a lot of sports people, especially in rugby, struggling mentally. It's the ups and downs, and it's competitive people, who are always wanting to win, and seeing themselves as failures rather than being able to step back and realize how lucky they are to be there doing the sport they love in the first place. And that's just human nature. So yes, I was competitive. I was always competing against my my younger brother, because he's 3 years younger than me, but he's actually quite a lot bigger than me. So it was often a fair fight, and I think that probably drove quite a bit of the competitive instinct in me. But at the same time, I would say that certainly now, but before, I was one of those people that could maybe move on from things quite quickly, which actually came to benefit me further down the line, I think, in my recovery.
Yeah, I mean, we've spoken to Tom Bates on the podcast before. He's a performance coach. He deals a lot with professional footballers as well as other sports people as well. And it's interesting. I mean, did you get any sort of psychological support during your sporting career prior to the accident? I mean, having 9 months off because of a shoulder injury when you're a competitive sports person is hugely, it's a massive setback. So, I mean, that's a lot to deal with.
Yeah, no, is the answer. Not at the time. It's got a lot better since then. So we're talking nearly 15 years ago now, when I had my first sort of shoulder reconstruction, and my rise sort of, I don't know, my trajectory up to that point was quite sharp. I'd captained under 18s, I'd signed for Bath, I got my debut at a young age, and then all of a sudden shoulder injury. Okay, fine, can manage that. These things happen, but then come back after 9 months and then shoulder injury again. So that looked like it could be the end of my career. Bath ended up releasing me, and I nearly retired then and went to uni. But Doncaster, who were in the Championship back then, offered me a contract, and they said, look, come and give it one more crack in the Championship. And bit of a culture shock for me, being the sort of posh kid from Bath going up to Doncaster. But actually, a lot of my family are from Sheffield and from that area, so there was an element of support there. But within a week, I was absolutely loving it, and it was the best thing that could have happened to me from this change that was forced on me, that I thought was going to be terrible and terrifying.
Yeah.
I absolutely thrived up there, got on so well with everyone, ended up playing every week, and that became the new launch pad to my career. So that was the first example for me, I suppose, of change being not necessarily being a negative thing, and doesn't have to be scary. It's whatever you make of it, because that looked like a big negative thing coming my way, but ended up being one of the turning points in my career, really.
Yeah. Oh, that explains the Sheffield Wednesday connection then to your dad,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. That's it.
So tell us about what happened to your accident. I mean, most people would assume it was from rugby, but it's ironic that it was off the pitch to your mother, I guess.
Yes, yeah, it was. yeah, well, I was recovering from another shoulder injury. So I'd survived 8 years without having without needing a shoulder operation. I'd pretty much learned how to not tackle with my left side. No one had really noticed. If anyone had just run on my left shoulder, they'd have been straight through. But you get some experience of how to sort of push people off in different directions, and the old "your man" shout came into effect. But I was recovering from a shoulder operation. That was fine, but my career was actually going really well at that point. I'd moved to Wales. I was living in Cardiff. I was playing some of the best rugby in my life, really loving it. But then this shoulder injury came. So I was rehabbing until pre-season, until the next year.
How old were you at this time, sorry?
27.
27. Okay.
Yeah. And I went to family friends' house for a barbecue. So I went back to Bath for the weekend to stay with my parents because I wasn't playing, obviously. I went to family friends' house for a barbecue, had lunch, literally went down to the swimming pool. They had this feature pool. I hadn't been there before, but it was like not something you expect to see in Somerset, something you more likely see in the Hollywood Hills, but it had like a rock fall in one end and a waterfall in one end. And I just, wasn't paying attention, took my t-shirt off and dived in where the waterfall hit the water. And I think because where the waterfall hit the water, it was making the ripples, you couldn't see how deep it was, but you just kind of assume, if you don't stop to look, that where a waterfall is, it's probably deep. And there was a big rock face coming in. And I was about 18 and a half stone at the time, looked very different to what I do now. And I dived in at a steep angle, and what I thought was about 8 feet of water turned out to only be about 3 feet of water. So hit my head right on the top of my head. The disc in between C6 and C7 vertebrae, which is at the bottom of your neck, exploded. And one of the shards of disc cut my spinal cord in half. So what was a 12 millimeter thick spinal cord was now 6 millimeters thick, and my neck was dislocated. So it was a pretty serious spinal cord injury. I remember thinking, wow, that hurt. I've hit my head hard before. Kind of playing rugby, you do it for a living, but not that hard. And I thought I'd stand up, check if there's any blood coming off the top of my head. And try and not get any blood in that pool. But then it was when I couldn't move properly that it really dawned on me that there was something serious going on. And I couldn't move from the shoulders down almost instantly. And then that sort of confusion as to why I couldn't move quickly turned to panic of, oh no, I could drown here. Fortunately, my dad was in the pool and one of my mates. So they pulled me to the surface. My dad being a retired GP, kind of straight away thought there's something wrong with his spinal cord or his brain or something here. So let's immobilize him. Let's hold him still. So they floated me in the pool until the ambulance came. The ambulance came. Luckily, I had a few of my mates, not a few of my mates, but my dad and his friend and one of my friends there, some big guys to get me out of the pool. Being so heavy, it would have been tough otherwise. And then the journey to hospital, which was, I knew was only about 25 minute journey because I'd done it, I knew where I was near home. So, and it was a hospital that I was familiar with. I thought it only took that long, but I was told it took them a year for my dad to tell me, I think, until he realized I was in a good enough headspace. But actually it took 2.5 hours because they had to pull over 3 times to resuscitate me. So obviously that puts quite a different spin on how fortunate I feel to even be here, never mind be hobbling around and up mountains and stuff, because that certainly wasn't on the cards for a long time. But it definitely puts things in perspective, because there was no like shining lights and pearly gates. It was just feeling a bit sleepy, and I remember them being like, no, don't go to sleep. I was like, well, don't worry, we'll be there in 15 minutes, I'll just nod off. And it was actually quite relaxing. But yeah, it was obviously far more serious than I anticipated at that time. And the only person that knew that that knew how serious it was really was my dad, because he kept very calm, and it was very useful, obviously, having a doctor throughout this whole process. But because of the situation with my neck, your spinal cord affects everything, your blood pressure, your heart rate, all of those things. And he knew there was he said the first time he could relax was when I went into the operating theatre, because he knew that they wouldn't let me die on the operating table. But between the time I broke my neck and getting in there, that was a possibility. But I'm glad he didn't tell anyone, especially not my mum. Otherwise, there would have been panic stations.
Yeah, no, totally. Just to listener, like you've accurately described, when you have your spinal cord cut in that severe fashion, you do have a risk of losing output, and it sounds like that's what happened to you 3 times in the way. I mean, that's incredible. The fact that you're still here to talk. I mean, you've probably told this story like tens, if not hundreds of times. Has your emotional attachment to what happened on that day changed throughout that period? Like, how does it feel now, retelling that story for the nth time? Like, how has that changed for you?
So that's an interesting question. I think I've never had a real problem recounting it. It was something I thought I needed to do, and as a healing process, or just to kind of see if there was any demons there, if you like. And I've never had an issue with it because I can remember it all vividly as well, because I didn't lose consciousness. And I think it was something that sometimes those moments are either lost to shock or burnt in your memory. And for me, it's definitely burnt in my memory. And I actually went back after I left hospital. The first thing I did was go back to the pool and get in the pool, just again to see if there were any issues there, and there really haven't been. But in terms of recounting it, at the start, it was something that didn't seem real. I was just, this is what happened, and I wasn't really thinking about the knock-on effects of it and the repercussions of it for the rest of my life, not just on a personal level, but how it's now impacting other people, I suppose, through what I do with the charity and now the book. But it's weird because I think initially it was just repeating the same story over and over again. But now I know that the impact it's having on other people, or can have. And actually, I got to a point when I was in hospital, or just after I left hospital, when I started seeing some good coming from this negative situation, that I was like, if enough good comes from this negative situation, then it's no longer a negative situation. So the power is in my hands to turn this from a negative to a positive. And for me, that looked like helping others through my story, raising money for the charities that had supported me, but also other charities. And now that's snowballed onto my own charity and all of these sorts of things. So actually, so much good has come, in my opinion, enough good has come from that supposedly bad day that it's not a bad day anymore. So the honest answer is I don't have any issue recounting the story, because I actually see it as weirdly, given what I've just said about dying 3 times, I see it as a good day.
I think that speaks to like your personality, because it's really interesting to hear you say that one of the first things you did after treatment was go back to the pool to see if there are any issues, because like a traumatic event like that, as most people would describe it as, not as a good day, but an event like that would leave some scars for a lot of people. A lot of people would suffer from PTSD from that and might have a fear of water or going near pools or slipping and that kind of stuff. So I'm trying to see whether there is any connection between the resilient aspect of your personality and how you were prior to the event occurring, and whether there is a connection there.
Yeah, potentially. I mean, it wasn't. I love water, right? This is the irony. I used to be a swimmer when I was a kid. I've dived into countless pools and off countless cliffs and into the sea and all these sorts of things. And now I know how dangerous it can be, and especially being in the spinal unit and seeing how many other people have had their spinal cord injuries from diving into the shallow water. But it wasn't the water that broke my neck, it was the bottom of the pool. So it was that's the thing I have the issue with. I actually love water. It's really good for my rehab and recovery. It's where I now feel most free. On land I'm very limited compared to an able-bodied person, but in water, even though I still have limitations, because I could do it competently before, it's somewhere where I feel like I've got a level playing field with others, and I do a lot of sea swimming and cold water swimming, and I find that really helps. So no, it's definitely not something I have an issue with, and I think it probably helped that I was so comfortable in that space before it happened. you know, if water was something that scared me in the first place, I think it probably would, that definitely would have cemented it for me, but that just wasn't the case.
Yeah, yeah. So take us to after you've been taken to this trauma center, you've had a good procedure. What happens then? What's your next memory?
So yeah, I got taken to Southmead Hospital in Bristol, and I had a 7-hour operation to realign my spinal cord, remove all the bits of disc. An amazing surgeon, Mr. Brewer, happened to be on call that night, and he saved my life. You know, first of all, the paramedics in the ambulance, then Mr. Brewer on the operating table, you know, gave me that fighting chance. And then, you know, the last thing I remember is him saying to me on the operating table, you know, there's some outcomes here. Either you wake up and you know, you've got some movement back, you're a lot better. That's a very small percentage. You know, you'll wake up and there's no recovery yet, and we're gonna have to wait and see. There's also an opportunity. There's also, you know, the chance that you won't wake up. Now I've been told that before because it was my 7th operation. You know, rugby's a stupid sport. I've had knee operations, shoulder operations, and I know, as you obviously know, with anaesthetic, there is that tiny chance that you're allergic to it and you won't wake up. But it was the first time I really believed someone who'd said it to me. I could see it in his eyes. There was a real chance that, you know, that this was a very serious operation. But the next thing I knew, after going under, apparently, well, he said to me, actually, when I went back to see him, he said, you said the weirdest thing that I've ever been told when I've read someone their last rites, if you like, is I said, oh, don't worry, just give it your best shot. And I can't remember, I can't remember saying that, but he said it was a nice way to go into the operation, because normally it's just look of fear and panic and it puts this pressure on. But I was obviously still in shock as well, saying things like that. But no, fortunately, I woke up in intensive care. So that was the first win, you know, actually waking up in the first place. But I had no movement or sensation from the shoulders down, pretty much. I could hitch my shoulder a little bit, which was kind of expected because that was above the level of the injury. But even after, you know, I couldn't breathe properly because you lose all power to everything, you know, your diaphragm, your intercostal muscles, you know, you can't breathe, you can't cough. I was on my back, obviously in the spinal brace in this intensive care unit, and some of the worst things, some of the hardest things to deal with, you know, the next few days were rock bottom, because it was the uncertainty of what was going to happen and where I was going to end up, but also things like, when you're lying on your back, you don't realize how much you clear your throat, just go like that. And I couldn't do that. I didn't have the power. So I'd get some saliva in my throat and it'd feel like I was drowning. And obviously they gave me a button, you know, to press, but I couldn't press it because I couldn't move. So that's when I first started learning about mindfulness and breathwork techniques. Just, it was forced upon me because I had to go inside my head and slowly breathe through my nose, because the more I panicked, the more I couldn't breathe. And then obviously the bed baths, not being able to go to the toilet for yourself, you know, people you've met for the first time all of a sudden have got their fingers up your bum, which is quite a strange scenario. And it was hard for someone, I suppose, who's a proud young bloke, professional sportsman, felt very capable and able, and kind of my physicality and my body was my identity. And all of a sudden I was just a head on a pillow, dealing with these uncertainties. But again, hats off to the staff there and the nurses, and just the how calm and capable they are, and they put you at ease. And you know, within days, you know, it's not any easier, but all of those things that were very strange, they've made seem very normal. But yeah, the first sort of, it took 6 days of Asia tests before an Asia test is American Spinal Injury Assessment, and it's pinpricks. I know you'll know a lot of this stuff, but just for
the listener, yeah, this is great. Yeah,
it's like pinpricks. They check with temperature, and it's basically working out what nerves are damaged, because you've got different nerve tracts that you know, that manage motor function, pain, pressure, light touch, all of these sorts of things. So it takes about an hour. And after day 5, I was still category Asia A1, which is the highest level of spinal cord injury. And I think the surgeon thought that I needed to hear it straight. I think they hadn't thought that I was sort of coming to terms with the situation. So he came in one morning and was like, listen, Ed, you need to realize that your category is your A1 after 5 days. The likelihood of you ever walking again is minimal, almost zero. We're hoping we can get some use of your arms back so you can be independent. And obviously that was a bit of like being punched in the stomach pretty hard. My wife and my mum were in the room, and I think we'd all been thinking it, but no one had actually verbalized it yet. And he had just said it out loud. And I remember the look on their faces, and just this weird sort of feeling came over me. It was one of shock. I felt like I'd just been punched in the stomach, but then straight away one of, right, okay, you need to stop feeling sorry for yourself here, because this isn't just you that this is affecting. You know, the word independence, and looking at my mum and my wife, I knew that at that point, if I didn't do everything I could to get better, I'd never be able to live with myself. You know, in 6 months or a year's time, if I look back and I knew I'd cut corners, and it was then affecting other people's lives, I wouldn't be able to live with myself. Whereas if I'd done everything I could and I was still flat on my back in a hospital bed or needing full-time care, then at least I'd tried. You know, and up until that point, I had been feeling sorry for myself. You know, I had been in that sort of victim mindset. You know, why me? You hear of these things happening, but you never expect it's actually going to be you. It felt like it was still all a bit of a dream and a blur. But from that moment on, when he sort of said those words, my attitude completely changed. And I spent every waking minute just sort of staring at my toes and my hands and just imagining them moving, because that's all you can do. It's not like you can take yourself to the gym and work really hard to get fit or whatever. It's just visualization, closing your eyes. And then eventually 48 hours later, I say eventually, only 48 hours later, my big toe started wiggling. And I remember thinking, oh, that's a spasm. Must just be a spasm, because I was having a lot of spasms, and then I did it again because I couldn't feel it, but I could see it, and my brain was telling it to do it. And then just being like, Mum, get in here. I think my toe's wiggling, and just this bizarre scenario where you've got a room full of your family and nurses staring at your little toe moving and all crying. It used to take, winning trophies and man of the match awards on a rugby pitch to make me happy, and now this is the happiest moment of my life, and all I'm doing is wiggling my toe. But I suppose that just sort of a bit of a lesson in perspective, but it just meant that there was some hope. There was something working below the level of my injury. I'd started getting a bit more use of my shoulder back by that point, but that was expected. This was a sign that there was a connection still active there. And I knew, even though there was still part of my spinal cord attached, as you know, like, it could have been dead. And most complete injuries, it's actually very, very rare to sever a spinal cord. If you do, it'll often end up fatally. But when you hear complete spinal cord injury, it's normally because of the pressure and the compression in the spinal column from the swelling will have killed a complete cross section of your spinal cord. So that might have been the case for me, but this was a sign that it wasn't, and there was something to work with. And then as soon as I had that hope, my mentality changed, and bit by bit, my body started coming back to me through a lot of hard work, not just on my part, but on the physio's part, my family's part. Everyone that was involved. Recovering from this issue has been this injury has been a massive team effort. It's definitely not just about me.
Yeah, I think for the listener, what I might do is attach an image of spinal cord cross section on the show notes, and just show where the different areas pass through of the different nerves and how they innervate motor and sensory function. Because what you're describing there is pretty miraculous, considering you had no movement at day 5, and you had such a severe spinal cord injury to start off with. And to go from essentially being waterboarded by your own saliva straight after surgery, and that is really, like, that's how some people describe it. It's the most frightening experience, feeling that you're gasping. There's nothing you can do, and the fact that you can't even push a button as well, to now being able to move your little toe. I mean, that is huge progression. And there's something about the mindset, because it sounds quite impossible from those moments. I mean, were you taught mindfulness or meditation prior to that? I mean, you said that's essentially what you started doing on day one, because almost out of necessity. But then something else must have kicked in. So, like you mentioned, visualization. You mentioned that sort of positive energy. Well, where did that come from, or is that something that your family brought to you?
No, I didn't have a clue about any of this stuff, and it's kind of with the book, which is this is kind of where I've gone with the book, because there was a lot of different mental processes I went through when I was in hospital and during my recovery, which was obviously human instinct defending itself, or they were natural processes that I fell back into as a way of dealing with my situation. So early on, it was like, the mindfulness sort of breath work, and then reframing became a big element of it. Seeing the positives, understanding the mind body link. This happened as I was going through my recovery. I started noticing that actually when I was in a positive headspace, my body would react positively. I would recover better, and actually it was almost flipping it the other way around and putting more importance on getting my head in the right place in order to recover, rather than trying to get the body in the right place so that I would feel better. And these things I just happened naturally. I didn't have any interest in philosophy, psychology, any of these sorts of things before. But then obviously I started reading into them throughout the process, and then following and up until this point, I've taken quite a lot of interest in these areas: philosophy, psychology. I've done the NLP course and all of these sorts of things. And it's funny relating them all back to these situations that were happening in hospital, just by, just as human nature. And that's kind of where the book goes. It's the story of my recovery and someone going through a traumatic, life-changing experience, and how it came out the other side. But it's also linking in those tangible processes like mindfulness, that we can take away and benefit us in everyday life. Because some of these things that I realized I have stayed with me, and I use daily to make my life and they make my life better anyway. And people talk about post-traumatic growth, it's and that I've definitely experienced that, and I wouldn't ever advise anyone goes and has a life-changing injury to try and experience post-traumatic growth. But I think there's a lot of things that happen to someone after trauma that can benefit other people that haven't necessarily experienced trauma before.
Take us through. So you're wiggling your left toe. Take us through the next steps there. I know there were probably a number of different punctuations across your rehab journey, but how long were you in rehab for, and what was the progress after that huge win?
Yeah, so I was in intensive care for 2 weeks, and that was effectively trying to get my blood pressures to normalize. So I was on drugs for that. And then I was moved to the RUH in Bath, which was sort of my local hospital, into the neuro ward there to wait for a bed to open up at specialist spinal unit. At that point, I was still flat on my back. I got some wiggling toes, and so I got my wiggling fingers in my right hand, but not much more apart from that. And obviously, wiggling toes doesn't mean you're going to be walking again. A lot of people in wheelchairs, and I know a lot of people in wheelchairs now, can stand up and can even take a few steps, but they need a wheelchair to get around. So it wasn't like I was out of the woods, but there was some hope. And actually, when I moved to the RUH in Bath, I met a physio who features quite heavily in my book, called Pete, who was the head neurophysio there, crazy looking little Italian guy. And I'd heard rumours of Pete in the intensive care unit, how much of a legend he was and how experienced he was. And I had this image in my mind of what Pete would look like, and then he came around the corner, and I nearly asked him, he had like full Puma tracksuit on. He was like nearly 60. I nearly asked him, like, "Hi mate, do you know where Pete is?" He's like, "Yeah, that's me." And he ended up being the next person after the paramedics, after Neil Brewer, who was the surgeon. Pete was the next key in the cog that really pushed me forward. And he did that not just through his technical ability. Some of the best physios I've worked with, I've been lucky to work with some great physios in hospital and since I've left hospital. they just have a knack for it. And I think with neuro, it's kind of, you've got to be a bit of a Jedi to be a really good neurophysio. They have a feel for it, because obviously your neurology is very different. A really good musculoskeletal physio, they're very knowledgeable. There's a process they go through. But with neuro and long-term rehab and life-changing injuries, a lot of it's mental, and they almost have to be psychologists at the same time. And Pete said to me straight away, he said, "We'll get you back on your feet." And he's since admitted to me that he didn't actually believe that, but
Wow.
judging by my scan results, but he knew that if I didn't believe it, then it would never happen. And up until that point, I'd been told I was never going to walk again. So that mindset change made a big difference. And I think if he was towing the party line, he probably shouldn't have said that to me. But, he had been around the block enough times to know that the importance of having my head in the right place. And then he used to be in the army, and we sort of kicked off with, he knew that I just wanted to get going. I think it was in me as like, as a sports person, that I just wanted to have something to do and to feel like I was recovering and pushing myself. So he'd like leave things in the room for me, like broom handles, and be like, do 400 reps of that. And he knew that I'd try and do 500. And he's very good at managing me emotionally. So the next 4 weeks, he actually got me from flat on my back with a wiggling foot to the day before I went to Salisbury Spinal Unit. They managed to stand me up, which was probably too early to stand me up. You have these things called tilt tables and sorting out your blood pressure, and so you don't pass out and all of these sorts of things. But he knew that the way the protocols were, that if I'd gone to Salisbury having not stood up yet after 6 weeks, I would have gone on their sort of pathway to leaving hospital in a wheelchair. So they would have just got me better at managing myself and being independent. But he knew that if I'd stood up once before I went, and that was in my notes, then they were obliged to get me on the back to standing protocol. So that was the other way he really helped me out. And then I ended up going to Salisbury Spinal Unit. And I would say throughout this whole process, as I've said, like the NHS is incredible. It saved my life. All of these amazing people who are still friends of mine, some I still work with. But resources are obviously really tight, and especially in long-term rehab. So they can, if I was in a private clinic in America or whatever, then it would have been sort of 7 or 8 hours of input a day, but it was 3 or 4 hours of input a week, because that's all that could be supplied. But Pete was willing to, he realized I had a room full of rugby players or my wife or family every day, and he would train them to do bits of rehab with me. So I was getting that extra input, which made a huge difference to my recovery in the long run, and which isn't necessarily by the book, having people who aren't professionals touching you when you've just had a spinal cord injury. But he knew that was the only way. He saw a glimpse, a chance, and he was willing to bend the rules, I think, to help me realize that. And I went off, and then I went to Salisbury Spinal Unit, met another amazing physio called Kim, and all of a sudden was around a lot of other people with spinal cord injuries. Because up to that point, I've kind of been in a side room on a neuro ward, and I felt a bit isolated, or it was still just a bit, I was in a bubble. But then all of a sudden I was surrounded by 40 other people with spinal cord injuries. And I realized 2 things straight away. First one was, it wasn't just full of like extreme sports athletes and bullfighters and the kind of people you'd expect to get spinal cord injuries. It was a complete cross section of society, which at first I was quite disappointed about, because I was looking forward to meeting a load of X-Games athletes. You realise that these things just happen. A lot of them were medical complications or tumours or very benign ways to get spinal cord injury, but also, there was all ages, men, women, all religions, races, it didn't matter. And that made me realize that these spinal cord injuries can happen to anyone, and there's no fault involved. There was a lot of good people in there that bad things had happened to. So that helped me start removing some of the blame from myself. And I think to that point, I was carrying a bit of blame. I felt guilty for making a mistake like that. But then spending time with other people and hearing how they had their accidents, became very good friends with a guy called Rick, who just picked up his toddler and a disc in the bottom of his back blew out, and now he's in a wheelchair, for the rest of his life. That simple, and that helped me start removing some of the blame. And then the next big realization was, even though I was in a bad place, I wasn't walking by that point, I'd stood once, but it didn't mean I was out of a wheelchair. I was improving, I was moving, I was getting that little bit of movement every day, not every day, but most days I was moving in the right direction. And also I was a lot better off than some other people, they were had permanent trackies in, couldn't breathe for themselves. And I started feeling, lucky about my situation. I started being fortunate about the position I was in rather than feeling unlucky about the position I was in. I started feeling grateful that I wasn't still on the bottom of that at the swimming pool. I could have quite easily died. I started feeling grateful that my dad was there to immobilize me after knowing to hold me still after the accident, because a lot of the damage caused in spinal cord injury is actually done in the handling after the accident. If it was just my friends, they probably would have just dragged me out of the water, and rightfully so. You wouldn't expect them to do anything else, but it could have been a different story. And the fact that I was improving, I realized, you've got no right to complain, to feel sorry for yourself anymore. Look around you. You're really lucky to be in the position you are, and have some hope to improve for the future. And that mindset change, feeling lucky about my situation rather than unlucky about it, my body started reacting, and I just kicked on massively. And after 6 weeks in the spinal unit, so 3.5 months in total from the accident, I left in a wheelchair, but I had taken my first few steps by that point, using foot splints and parallel bars and stuff. But I was on the roads to being a walker again, and that was something that just 3.5 months previously I'd been told was never going to be a possibility. So it was starting to turn from a horror story into one of hope and positivity. And after another 4 or 5 months of rehab, I decided I wanted to do something to raise money for the charities that supported me since I'd left, but also give myself a goal and a target. We spoke about shoulder injuries before with rugby, and you go, right, you could go in the diary, right, shoulder reconstruction, 9 months, that's how long rehab takes, that's the game, so I'm going to aim for that. You had something to aim for. But for this, it was just endless. It was like, we don't know how far you're going to get. You're going to be rehabbing for the rest of your life. Good luck. So I needed to put a challenge in place for myself. So I told Pete, physio, that I wanted to climb Snowdon on the year mark, and he thought I meant 2-year mark, because I was still using a wheelchair after 9 months. So I had 3 months. I said no, on the 1-year mark, set myself the challenge, and he thought I was mad, but I said, look, I'm going to go for it. If you want to join me, you can. So obviously they had no choice but to come with me, and I opened it up to anyone.
So at 9 months, you were in a wheelchair, and how many steps were you taking at this point?
I was walking in rehab, so a lot like with poles or in parallel bars. Okay. So I was using a wheelchair day to day to get around, but I probably walked up to sort of, I don't know, a few hundred meters in one go.
Okay, that's a big stretch to go to Snowdon then.
I'd sort of, I don't know, my mind had changed, I think, a bit in terms of where you contemplate life, obviously having died a few times, but also the situation I was in, and you just think, what's the worst can happen? You go for it and you don't make it, but at least you set. The main motivation for me was to send a message to the other people in hospital who had been told they weren't able to do something or might not be able to do something. I was lucky to have the support network to tell me otherwise and to motivate me in another way. And I realized how important my mental state was to my recovery. And most of that came from outside, that came from people supporting me. But there were loads of people who didn't have that. And I wanted to at least send a message to those people. There was a bit of a shop window there with being an ex-rugby player. And I knew if I did something on the 1-year mark, even if it was climbing 200 meters up Snowdon and failing miserably, at least people had gone, oh, well, Ed was told he'd never walk again. And look, he managed to do that. And I've been accused in the past of maybe giving people false hope, and that, only a couple of times. But I think I don't agree with that, because I think the word hope means it might or might not happen. That's the whole point. And I'm very, You know, I always say, you know, you can only recover to within the scope of your injury. You know, if I had a severed spinal cord, then I wouldn't be walking. But if you want to maximize that recovery within the scope of your injury, you need to believe that you can push on and you can get further. And you might not reach that point. You know, I didn't reach that. I haven't reached that point. I can't run around. You know, I've still got loads of health complications, you know, unseen ones and seen ones with movement. But I've got so much further than I would have if I had just succumbed and believed that I was never going to walk again. So I wanted to try and do something that sent that message out to the masses. And by doing that on the 12-month mark, I thought that would be quite poignant. Fortunately, we did actually make it to the top. It was the hardest I've ever done in my life. It took 9 hours. I opened it up to anyone who wanted to come and join in. So I'd started a blog during hospital that gained some traction. And I thought maybe a few people, family members and a couple of dogs would turn up, but there were 70 people on the start line that I didn't even know, which blew my mind and definitely put the pressure on. I had to get up there then. But we just had the most amazing weekend, sharing stories with each other, and these strangers I'd never met, you know, they were there for their own reasons and things that they were going through, and that sort of sparked the idea for the charity. And I remember being stood on top of Snowdon and just sort of looking out and thinking, and just feeling happy for the first time and feeling like I'd had some real purpose in my life. And I was like, look at all the people stood around here, smiling, laughing with each other that they hadn't met before, you know, surrounded by all the people that got me to that point as well, physios, doctors, friends and family. And I just felt like this is something I need to do something with. I didn't know what it was at that point, but I just felt so useless for so long. I'd lost what I thought purpose was, you know, with rugby. And I'd felt lost, I suppose. And then all of a sudden I felt it again. That spark was lit, and I kind of haven't looked back from that point.
Mate, I've just got this image of you staring down at the top of Snowdon, just feeling so fulfilled. I mean, it's literally putting like my hairs up on the back of my neck. It's an incredible vision, and what you've been able to achieve is just remarkable, mate. I'm glad you picked up on the concept around giving people false hope, because I think within medicine we are sort of we're suggested to not give too much hope to patients for fear of false hope, for fear of, you know, giving them the wrong impression about what's achievable and stuff. I'm a bit of a rebel against that concept. I think we actually need to swing for the fences, and we need to allow people who are willing to put in the effort and allow us to be able to motivate them through different means, whether it be through health coaching, whether it be through visualization, through giving them goals to achieve something that might seem impossible. I think we actually need to be a bit more comfortable. We're practicing quite litigious medicine these days, and we have to be quite careful about, you know, what people might say or how people might react in the wrong way. So it's an interesting concept, and I'm now beginning to understand why you called your book Lucky, because of that reframing. And it's again, like I use the same word, remarkable. It's remarkable how you came round to that idea about how grateful you were considering your circumstances, because a lot of people in a similar situation would feel very hard done by, and rightly so. You know, it's very easy to see how people might fall in that pattern, like, why me? Why is this happening to me? And then spiral into shame and depression. But you're able to rise out of that. Not a lot of people can do that.
Just to go back to what you said, I'm really glad you said that about being a bit of a rebel, you know, but for the right reasons. And I think it does have to be carefully measured. But all of the people who had the most impact on me throughout my time in hospital were a bit of a rebel for the right reasons, because the structures are there the structures are there within the NHS or within any medical practice, and the guidelines are there. But they need to be able to be bent into, because every individual patient's case is different, right? And every person's different, and their mental processes are different. And it's about going around it in the right way. It's not saying you are going to get better, you know, but you at least saying there's a chance and we're going to get through this, you know, not you know, making it inclusive and making sure that that person's mindset is looked after as much as their stats on paper. So I completely agree with you on that point. And in terms of the reframing and why the book is called Lucky, that happened as a result of my injury. And I think that reframing was a defense mechanism of my brain, being able to look at the positive side. If I spent the whole time feeling, in that victim mindset, feeling how unlucky I was, it would have eaten me up. But it's amazing how reframing everything becomes a practice, and it's now spilled over into the rest of my life. And all of those things that I used to take for granted, I don't take for granted anymore. Spending nearly a year in a wheelchair, I feel so lucky that I can now just step up one step. Before, stepping up a step did not make me happy, but now I smile every time I manage to walk down the stairs in the morning, and all of my friends and family that I used to take for granted, every day I would wake up in my hospital bed and everything had been taken away from me. My body, the way I moved, my control of my bowels and everything. But my friends and family were stood there, and they were the one thing that no one could take away from me at that point. And now I would never take them for granted anymore. That time when your mum rings you and she's been speaking for half an hour and you're holding the phone away from your head. Sorry, mum.
Everyone's done that.
I just don't do that anymore as much as I might want to sometimes. But I think once you repaint your life with appreciation because you've had it all taken away, I now live every day, full of gratitude and in a way more positive place than I did before, because all of those little things, as I said, that I used to take for granted, I just don't. And that's as a result of that mindset change, and the bigger picture with the accident is now spilled over into everyday life.
Yeah, I love that term you just used, painting your life with appreciation. That should be a t-shirt. You mentioned philosophy earlier. I wonder who were like the first sort of books or philosophers you listened to during your recovery journey?
Yeah, so one of my friends gave me a book called The Obstacle is the Way, which is about stoicism. Ryan Holiday.
Love that book.
Yeah, which was very poignant, obviously, given the obstacle I was facing. But a lot of it rang really true with me. And then I kind of deep dived into stoicism, and it's still something that I implement in everyday life. The grounding message of you can't affect what happens to you, you can only affect how you respond, which is such an important one, and not beating yourself up about the things that you can't affect, including other people's opinions. And life chucks stuff at all of us, curveballs at all of us all the time. And it's, and actually I found further than just dealing with them and not getting too affected by them in a negative way, is using them to grow as a person. Most of the growth that I've experienced as a person has come as a result of the challenges I've faced. So I welcome them now, and I actually put myself in situations that are outside of my comfort zone, that are going to challenge me, that are a bit scary, because that's the only way I feel that I can develop and grow. Now that stoicism then led me into a bit more spirituality and Buddhism, Taoism, which, if you told this to a 20-year-old rugby player, Ed Jackson, he would have laughed at you, called it wishy-washy, mumbo jumbo, typical naive, stubborn, whatever. But I mean, I've become quite a spiritual person as a result of understanding that mind-body link, but also, there's real science behind the philosophies and how they impact you. It's no longer just, they're there for a reason. And I'm now much more peaceful. I meditate. I'm terrible at it, but I do find it very useful. I'm persistent, but I find it in other ways. For me, moving meditation, being outside in nature, I have to concentrate so hard on not falling over all the time that it's hard to think about anything else. So I just go and pick I go and pick an uneven bit of ground and just try and not fall over for an hour. And I find afterwards my head's very clear. But lots of different things that have helped with philosophy and spirituality with my recovery, and a lot of it is in the book. Actually, I've tied it a lot back to realizing these things for the first time just naturally, but then how the research and how the further reading into it has made it go, oh yeah, that wasn't just you, that is an actual thing. So my interests have changed drastically from being a rugby player and just trying to complete Call of Duty and then beat people up on a rugby pitch. I'm quite a different character now, but actually I think that I feel more at home being like this, and I think actually I've reverted back to type, and actually the rugby player image was something that I'd put over the top. I wasn't born like that, and my interests, I feel a lot more comfortable now with where I am, and being more open-minded and being able to dabble into different areas than those societal sort of tramline pressures that I had as a rugby player. This is the way you should be, this is the way everyone else is, this is how you fit in. Now that's all been taken, the shackles have been taken off, and I still love rugby, I still work in it a lot, and there's still elements of that character that are still instilled in me, and I think actually a lot of the character that was instilled in me as a rugby player has been very important for my recovery. You know, that work ethic, the respect, the teamwork, the team element, you know, has been really important for my recovery, but also for me as a person. But at the same time, being able to strip that away and open my mind up to different possibilities, what I thought was game over, I've got no purpose anymore, I've lost the one thing I'm good at, is actually, no, that's moved out of the way. Now you can go and try loads of different stuff, and I've actually found more purpose in other things now.
You know, that's really interesting. I didn't actually think about how it's almost like an element of your post-traumatic growth, about how, because you're having to be your most vulnerable self, i.e. everything's been stripped away, you can actually be authentic and actually be who you want to be. And that might have always been a spiritual person, but because you were fulfilling the characteristics of a rugby playing, competitive athlete, you were never allowed, we never gave yourself permission to be that person. And I'm glad you talked about the science behind everything that you're doing, because there is genuine science behind all the different elements that have helped you along your recovery journey, including meditation, visualization. In fact, I had Dr. Tara Swart, who I should connect you to actually, who is a neuroscientist, and she teaches at MIT. And her whole book called The Source is basically like the sciencey version of The Secret. But the whole book is about the science behind manifesting whatever your vision is, and how having a crystallized vision of what that is helps you on your journey. It increases neuroplasticity, which are the connections between your neurosynapses, and it can generally accelerate healing as well, which is a very controversial thing to say as a medic, because me talking about food as medicine, when I'm talking to patients with IBD, I have definitely had criticism myself of giving false hope, or giving the impression that food is a panacea. Food is not a panacea. It's just one of those elements that you have in your toolbox. And I think in our clinical toolbox, we have genuine things that we know work, like surgery, rehab, physiotherapy, but we also have psychotherapies, we have nutrition, we have a whole bunch of other sort of things that are a little bit more woo-woo, or as they would be described as, but there is a burgeoning science behind them that's going to hopefully solidify them for other medics, and it will become more commonplace to practice them.
Yeah, I mean, that term woo-woo is going to disappear, I hope. And it is disappearing, I think, because the science is being put behind these woo-woo, methods.
Yeah.
I love that. I love what you do with the Doctor's Kitchen, and I'm a massive believer in terms of nutrition and how that can help, and supplementation, and using as many natural ingredients as possible, and it's also about what you remove, right, as well as what you add in, and I've definitely felt that. I've definitely felt that for sure. And go back to what you said about people removing the purpose to then open your mind up to other opportunities. I think we create a narrative for ourselves, and actually more often than not, society creates a narrative for us. You might have just ended up being a little bit smarter, so you ended up doing maths, which then led you into accounting, which then meant and you end up as an accountant. You're like, well, I'm an accountant, I am boring, or I am only good with numbers. It's like, no, there's probably an inner artist in there somewhere And people are so scared of change that they'll actually carry on doing something that their path has led them to, even if it doesn't make them happy, because they truly believe that's what they were meant to do and that's all they could do. But actually, one tiny little change, one missed bus ride, whatever it might have been earlier on in their development, could have turned them into a completely different person. And I see it with rugby all the time. Just that's the example that I know. I work with a charity called Restart, who the Rugby Players Associations, they look after all the professional players in England. And there's a big issue with depression in professional sport, and especially in rugby, with the demographic being, I'm only talking about the male side, obviously there's young female rugby players as well, but the demographic being young males. I think a big part of it is down to people. You love the sport when you're coming through school. When it becomes a job, it becomes very different. You've got those pressures of selection, of injury, but also finances. You're looking after your family. You're being moved around the country from club to club. You're not earning like a footballer. It's not something you can do for 5 years and then, buy a load of houses and retire for the rest of your life. And I think a lot of players, they'll get criticised publicly in the press because they have a bad game, as if they've done it deliberately to annoy the fans. And they're sat there thinking, do you know what? I don't even like this. I just happen to be a bit more coordinated and maybe a bit bigger than the people at school. And then from that point, everyone told me I was so lucky to be doing that I couldn't possibly do anything else. But inside, you've got these frustrated inner doctors or artists, that's waiting to come out. And some people, you see it after people retire. It'll take 2 or 3 years, not normally a tough mental transition, but then they'll realize, wow, okay, I wasn't just a rugby player, I was something else. And they'll go on to have successful careers doing something else. But at the time, once you're engrossed in it, you think there's no way I could possibly do anything else. And I can't try and give that message to players now, to young players. You're so lucky to be doing what you're doing. It's an amazing thing to be playing professional sport with your mates, but don't lose sight of the bigger picture. Get out there and try things outside of the sport. As much to cross things off as to realize what you want to do afterwards, but it'll make you a more rounded person. As soon as you realize there's more to life and there's other things out there, it makes you a lot more comfortable in what you're doing at the time. And definitely, if you don't enjoy what you're doing, do not be scared of exploring other options. Now, the caveat to that is, don't just get up now and quit your job, and then come back. Well, Ed, you told me I was supposed to follow my dream. But it's fine to have hobbies and interests outside of what you do, and especially start exploring them if you're not happy with what you're doing right now. If it doesn't get you out of bed in the morning and you're looking forward, obviously there's going to be mornings when you don't want to go to work. That's natural. But if you're not excited or driven by what you do, then we only get to do this once, right? There's only one life. Have a think about changing it up, because, like I said before, all the best things that have ever happened to me have come after change, and usually change that no one would wish on anyone.
Yeah, and this aspect, this mental aspect that you've honed over the last few years since your injury, is this spilled out into your family, like your wife and your parents and your friends? Have they started reframing as well? Have they started changing their mindset?
Yeah, I'd like to think so. My wife definitely has. She gets annoyed at me sometimes though, because she's like, sometimes she just wants to come home from work and have a good whinge. And I'm there going, oh, look at the bigger picture. She's like, shut up. I just want to kick off about something for a bit. But no, it's definitely, instilled. She's having run the charity now. And in terms of getting a healthy dose of perspective all the time, the beneficiaries we work with, it makes you realize often how lucky you are. The rest of my family, I'd like to think so to a certain extent, some more than others maybe. And my friends, again, some of them will take the piss out about how annoyingly positive I can be. But also I'll get a lot of calls from them now, more than I would have before, when they're in a tough place, or when they're looking, or when they're just looking for, a bit of positivity. So I'd like to think it has spilled out a little bit. And I think I'm a big believer in these ripple effects. If you do these small acts of kindness, and just even to strangers, it can have a massive impact. It picks that person's day up. They do nice things to other people, and it makes a big difference. And we feel like we can just mope around and feel sorry for ourselves, and it's only going to impact us, but that also impacts other people in a negative way. So I try and do that as much as possible, try and give a bit of positivity to people day to day. But that's not saying that I don't get frustrated and pissed off as well, like anyone else does. I just think I'm maybe better at putting it in perspective quicker these days. You know, it's actually one of the Stoic philosophies, amor fati, which is like live in accordance with nature. And you know, it's understanding that your emotions are normal. You know, it's not about suppressing emotions. You get angry, you get sad, you know, that's absolutely fine, but it's about rationalizing those emotions quickly. You know, is this emotion useful for me or for the people around me? Right, okay, let's move it on. And that's where Buddhism crosses over as well, right? The mindfulness gap, you know, the gap between stimulus and response. This thing's happened to me. I'm feeling angry. Hang on a minute. Take a breath. Is this anger useful? No. All right. Move it on. Yeah, and that is a daily practice, and that's something that you continually try and get better at for the rest of my life. But it's definitely something that I'm way better at now than I was before.
Yeah, I'm glad we're talking about that, because I think it's easy for a lot of people to assume that you know, you're quite puritanical in your thoughts and you don't have any frustrations. And it's funny you said that about your wife, because during the the height of the pandemic, obviously my girlfriend was annoyed at the situation. You know, she was worried, she had anxieties, and I was always trying to reframe her. Like, actually, you know what, this year has actually been pretty good for this and this reason. And even though I was going into hospital and I was working full time, overtime, all the rest of it, you know, I could still see the positive elements, but that can be quite annoying for some people. So, you know, it's important, I think, to have a whinge and a whine, but then reframe those thoughts as to, is this thought serving me? Is this thought sucking my energy? How do I reframe this thought? And then go through that process. And Stoic philosophy is a really good way of engineering that sort of approach to life, because it's normal to have annoyances. It's normal to have negativity. It's just what you do with that on a day-to-day basis. And gratitude for me personally, something I practice every day by writing it down and journaling, has been super useful. Since climbing Snowdon, you've done a ton of other things. So you know, you've got your charity now. You've been climbing up a whole bunch of other tall mountains and hills and all the rest of it. I mean, what's the most exciting thing that you're working on at the moment?
The most exciting thing I think coming up is obviously the book launch next week. So the irony of being stuck in isolation in Iceland when my book comes out, and your book being called Lucky, is not lost on me. It's hilarious. However, you know, just trying to reframe the situation and get as much done from over here as possible and enjoy it as much as I can. I suppose that's one of the messages.
Yeah.
In the
we
book.
Should add some context to that. So you're currently isolating in Reykjavik, right?
Yeah. So lucky old me has got COVID, and I'm currently isolating in Reykjavik for 2 weeks, having just finished a trek in the least populated country in Europe. But you know, I'm feeling okay. I've been double vaccinated, so it's probably just this pesky Delta variant, and I think probably someone brought it over on the plane or something. But the rule is 2 weeks mandatory isolation, so I'm currently twiddling my thumbs over here. But yeah, apart from that, I'm luckily back in time to then fly to Japan for the Paralympics. So
amazing.
I'm over there broadcasting for Channel 4, heading up all of the team sports over there, which I'm obviously so excited about. The Olympics is on at the moment, which is great because it gives me something to do during the day whilst I'm stuck in this house. But I've always watched the Paralympics with massive admiration, not just because of the athletes, of course, but what Channel 4's done with it. And over the last sort of 2 games and the exposure they've given disability, and to play a part of that is going to be a massive privilege, but also a massive challenge. You know, live TV is actually way more petrifying than running out against Samoa, you know. So it's a different challenge, but it's great to be challenging yourself. You know, it gives me some motivation to try and improve in a different direction. And then the charity, you know, the charity is going from strength to strength. It's strength. We're still very early on in our life cycle, but we're taking beneficiaries away now. So effectively the charity was set up to mirror my own recovery. So using the outdoors and challenging yourself. So from climbing Snowdon, then gone on to do stuff in the Alps, in the pool, to kind of instill that bit of confidence, but also to shake you out of the rut you might be in. So we take people who are suffering with their mental health because of trauma. So that might be physical trauma or psychological trauma. So we're taking people away with PTSD, spinal cord injuries, whatever it might be. Take them away on a challenge as the catalyst for change, and then put sort of a 3-year development program in place and a support network around them of life coaching, retraining, therapy, whatever it might be that they need, to cement that change, cement that recovery. Because, as much as nature and the mountains gave me in terms of my recovery, the real reason I'm in the position I am is because of my support network. And I almost felt guilty for that, because so many people don't have that support network. So through the charity, we try and offer other people that support network effectively. And now we're starting to see some real changes in people, and it's incredibly rewarding and grounding, and it's where my passion lies. However, as my wife keeps reminding me, it is our passion, because it doesn't pay us any money. We do it all voluntarily. So keeping things like the broadcasting going, I've got my podcast, It's Good to Walk, and I deliver talks to businesses around change management and resilience and stuff. So that sort of puts a roof over our head for now. But so many different exciting, weird things that I never imagined I would ever be doing when I was a rugby player. I did a degree in real estate finance, and I was going to go and work in the city in commercial property. And actually, I did go and do that for a bit. And I didn't hate it. And in fact, if I did go and work in the city, that's probably what I'd do. And everyone was great and everyone was lovely. But I just remember thinking, look, you've just got to give it a shot. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. You can come back to this, but you've got to follow your passions in life. Life's too short. So we did, and things are working out at the moment. But the fact I don't, 5-year plan, no idea. And I know it's important to have plans, but that used to terrify me. But for the first time now, I'm excited about, I don't know what I'm going to be doing in 5 years' time. I think I focus on the processes, try and stick to my core values, whatever they might be, work ethic, honesty, positivity, those sort of things, and watch life unfold. And at the moment, it's unfolding in lots of weird and wonderful directions. Where it'll end up, I don't know. But feeling very lucky to be doing what I'm doing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you said that, because I think there's, particularly in today's society, there's so much pressure to have a 5-year or a 10-year plan. I constantly get asked about it with the doctor's kitchen. Where do you see this? Like, what's the mission and all the rest of it? I mean, I have a mission and I enjoy the process, but I couldn't tell you or crystallize exactly what it's going to look like. I would love to know, but it's tough. But when you do find something you do want to achieve, like for you at Snowdon, and if you can crystallize that and focus on that, it's hugely impactful in terms of your ability to achieve it. And I'm just super excited about this charity. I mean, that sounds like something we as the NHS should be funding, because I think the support network element of it is so under-recognized. People talk about the foundations for health, and yes, there's nutrition and sleep and exercise and all the rest of it, but sense of purpose and community are things that are integral to human nature, and so important for recovery, as well as just normal day-to-day and living. So I really commend you on recognizing that, and it's an incredible vision for the charity, man. I can't wait to see that grow.
Yeah, thanks, mate. Yeah, that peer-to-peer support is just so important. When I was lucky to have it through starting the blog, and people got in touch with. And initially, I was very private and very guarded. I suppose it was just not showing any weakness. It kind of instilled in me as a young guy, as a rugby player, and I'd started this voice notes. Couldn't move. I'd started this diary through voice notes, just a way of offloading before I went to bed to try and sleep. Woke up one afternoon after sort of passing out after doing some rehab, and my mate was going through all my voice notes. And as your friends do, you're private.
Yeah.
And he was like, two things, mate. First of all, you're a weirdo. Second of all, you should make some of this public, because it might help some people one day. Because it was just about day-to-day life in the hospital for a long time. And it took some persuading, but eventually I did. I started documenting my, day to day, what happened that day, what my thoughts and emotions were, and I thought it was to potentially help one or two other people one day, but actually it really started helping me, because people started coming out of the woodwork and going, I was there, been through it before. Try this, try that. Don't worry, keep your head up, and that support that I got from peers effectively made the biggest difference psychologically for me, because not only did I have people giving me practical advice, and often it wasn't advice any different that the doctors would be giving me, but it was coming from someone who had been there. So it just sinks in that little bit more. But more than that, it gave me an outlet of people to speak to that I didn't mind being completely open and honest with, about my emotions, about the nitty gritty things that I didn't want to talk to my mum or my wife about, because these were strangers and these were people who could relate to it. And I felt that power. Millimeters to Mouths is as much a community as it is, direct practical help. We've seen the beneficiaries help each other more than we help the beneficiaries, and watching that process happen, putting these people together, and seeing them heal each other, and then all of a sudden go from an isolated situation. If it's someone who's really struggling with depression or anxiety, often they've isolated themselves for a long time. So it's getting them out of that isolation and putting them with people, and they go, hang on a minute, it's not just me in this situation. And watching the impact that has is incredible.
Yeah, that sounds like a formula that could be applied to so many different areas as well. And we're seeing that actually with tech, how peer-to-peer networks that have a specific focus around them, like I'm thinking of Health Unlocked, that the online communities around different health issues has been super impactful, and that's actually been proven out as well. There's a landmark paper that came out in JAMA a few years ago. And also on the note about the voice notes, how many voice notes did you record?
I've recorded a lot.
Oh, really?
Voice notes, just through my Alexa, and then eventually, when I started being able to move my hand and arm enough, I started typing on an iPad. Got an iPad in front of me, so it was transcribing the voice notes effectively.
Yeah.
And then I started being able to type, and it became my rehab as well, to use different fingers. So every evening I'd write around about my day. And it was quite funny, actually. I got a letter from my old English teacher at school whilst I was still in hospital. And it just literally said, it was a lovely letter. He was a legend of a guy, but he was like, Ed, I never knew you were actually listening. Which was just so him, like backhanded compliment way of saying he was quite impressed with the way I was writing. But I never wrote before, really, and It was actually through that process of trying to heal that I actually found out I really enjoyed it, to the point where I've now got a book out, which is kind of crazy. But it's also a tool that I recommend to anyone. You said you journal. I think it's a really, even if no one else ever reads it, it's a really sort of a great way of practicing gratitude, offloading emotions, processing thoughts, and then if you do have the confidence to write about, to put things out there, you're always nervous that how people are going to respond, but you'd be amazed. Everyone is going through their own stuff, their own crap, and being able to and sharing yours encourages other people to share theirs. And together, like we've just mentioned, that community, that peer-to-peer support is so powerful. So I would encourage people to do that as well.
Yeah. Well, mate, I've learned so much on this short amount of time that we've been chatting here. Painting your life with appreciation, I think, is my takeaway. And if there's anyone else that's listening, journaling, all the other tips that you came up with in terms of reframing and gratitude are things that are fantastic. And I'm sure there's going to be a whole bunch more tips in the book, Lucky. And I can't wait to see you on live TV, mate. Hopefully not as nerve-wracking as it might sound, or you might think it might be, but I'm sure you're going to thrive on TV.
Yeah, I can't wait. It's really exciting. Yeah, and I've really enjoyed our chat, and I can't wait to hopefully one day meet in person.
Definitely, absolutely, mate. Yeah. I can't wait. It's been a privilege. It's been my pleasure.